On the night they threw me a farewell party at a lakeside lodge, I heard something hit the ice in my whiskey, then dissolve. My nephew leaned in like it was nothing. I didn't confront him. I simply accidentally dropped my stir stick and switched cups. Minutes later, he raised a toast, then started to unravel, like share and subscribe. I never imagined my farewell night would turn into the moment I truly understood who my nephew had become. After 30 years advising an energy company contracts, liability, investigations, crisis meetings, I thought I had seen every kind of quiet betrayal people could hide behind a smile, but nothing prepares you for the kind that shows up wearing your family name. The lodge sat along the edge of a cold, dark lake, tucked into the pines like it belonged there. Heavy timber beams, a stone fireplace that snapped and breathed warmth into the room. One long table stretched through the main hall, set with linen runners and small candles that made everyone look a little softer than they really were. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the water was perfectly still. It reflected the moon like a clean mirror. Inside, the air smelled like cedar, citrus peel, and the faint smoke from the fire. The kind of place people choose when they want the night to feel important. And everyone there did. Old colleagues from corporate compliance, a few retired executives who still carried themselves like they were signing checks. Friends I'd made the hard way, through long years of late-night calls and high-stakes decisions. Even a couple of local officials who treated me like I was still the man to ask whenever something went wrong. They came to toast my exit, to celebrate the version of me that always had an answer. I stood near the fireplace accepting handshakes and compliments, nodding at stories I'd heard a dozen times. My smile was practiced, polite, the kind you learn to wear when you've spent a career keeping your emotions from becoming evidence. At some point, someone pressed a small velvet box into my palm. Inside was a tie clip, simple, silver, engraved with a date and 3 words. 30 years. Thank you. I didn't say much. I just held it for a second longer than I needed to. Because objects like that aren't about money. They're about time. About a life you can't rewind. In my other hand was a pen, black lacquer, gold trim, my initials etched into the side, a gift from the board years ago. I'd signed hundreds of agreements with that pen, decisions that protected thousands of jobs, decisions that ruined a few careers too. It was a reminder that words, when written down, can carry more weight than bullets. I slipped the tie clip into my pocket and capped the pen like I was sealing away the past. Then I looked down the table. Evan had organized everything. Every place card was perfectly aligned. Every glass was set at the same angle. Even the candles were spaced evenly, like the room had been measured with a ruler. He moved between guests with that smooth, attentive energy people mistake for love. "Uncle Marcus, you made it," he said, and pulled me into a quick embrace that looked genuine from a distance. Up close, I noticed the details. His jaw was a little tighter than usual. His smile came fast, but it didn't stay, and his eyes kept flicking table, door, window, like he was tracking something only he could see. If you didn't know him, you'd call it nerves. If you did know him, you'd call it calculation. He'd chosen my drink personally. He told everyone it was a proper send-off, a heavy-bottomed tumbler, amber whiskey over clear ice, the kind of drink that looks honest, simple, masculine, safe. That's what made it dangerous. People let their guard down in rooms like that. It's strange, but I've watched it happen for decades. The more formal the setting, the more quickly people assume nothing bad can occur. Because no one wants to be the person who ruins the night. No one wants to be the one who stands up and says, "Something's wrong," when everyone else is smiling for photos. So they ignore the small discomfort. They explain away the odd tone. They laugh when they should be listening. They swallow doubts the same way they swallow expensive whiskey slowly, quietly, and in front of witnesses. That night, the lodge wasn't just a venue. It was a shield. A beautiful polished cover that made everyone, including me, more willing to believe the story we came there to celebrate. And Evan knew that. He was counting on it. People think betrayal starts with hatred. Most of the time, it starts with familiarity. With someone who knows your routines, your soft spots, the parts of you that still believe love is enough to keep a person honest. That's why what happened at that lodge didn't just scare me. It broke something old in me. Because Evan wasn't some outsider. He wasn't a stranger with a grudge or a competitor with a motive. He was the kid I brought into my home. He was the kid I fed at my table. He was the kid I defended sometimes from the world, sometimes from himself. Evan came into my life when he was 9. His father disappeared early. His mother tried to hold everything together until she couldn't. There was a long stretch where he was passed between relatives the way people pass a problem they don't want to solve. When I got the call, it wasn't dramatic. No sobbing voice, no heroic music. Just a tired social worker telling me the truth in a flat tone. He needs a stable home. We're running out of options. I didn't make a speech about family. I didn't ask anyone's permission. I drove out, picked him up, and brought him back with me. That first night, he didn't unpack. He just sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, shoes still on, staring at the wall like he expected somebody to walk in and tell him it was temporary. I remember offering him dinner and watching him eat, like he didn't trust the food would keep coming tomorrow. That kind of hunger stays with you. It changes people. Over the years, I gave him what I believed a boy needed: structure, consistency, standards. Not because I wanted gratitude, because it was the right thing to do. I taught him small things first. How to shake a hand and look someone in the eye. How to show up on time. How to finish what he started even when it got boring. Then I taught him bigger things. When he struggled in school, I sat with him at the kitchen table until the numbers stopped scaring him. When he got older, I made him learn how to budget, how to save, how to live inside his means. He hated that part. Most people do, but I was proud of him anyway. Proud when he got his first real job. Proud when he walked across a stage and earned his degree. Proud when he told me he wanted a career in corporate law, because in my mind, that meant he wanted a life built on rules. And I won't pretend I didn't enjoy watching him become someone. I had no children of my own, no family name to pass down through generations. Evan became the closest thing I had to that. And maybe that's where I made myself vulnerable without realizing it. Because when you've sacrificed quietly for someone, you start to believe your sacrifice has power. You start to believe it protects you, that it buys loyalty, that it guarantees decency. It doesn't. Sometimes the very thing you're proud of becomes the blindfold you never meant to wear. I look back now, and I can admit something that was hard for me to say out loud. Back then, I was proud of what I did for him. Proud enough that I assumed he could never turn on me. Proud enough that I didn't notice how entitlement can grow in the shadow of generosity. By the time Evan married Laura, I thought the story had ended the way stories are supposed to end. Laura was steady, warm, the kind of person who remembers birthdays and writes thank you notes and makes people feel safe without even trying. The first time she met me, she brought a pie she baked herself and apologized for the crust like it was a crime. She called me Uncle Marcus with that respectful tone people use when they genuinely mean it. and I believed in her. I believed in them. Emily Ross did too, at least at first. Emily had worked with me for 12 years. She was the kind of colleague who didn't flatter you, didn't panic, and didn't miss details. If I was the one making decisions, Emily was the one noticing the small shifts in the room before anyone else did. She used to tell me, half joking, people don't fall apart all at once. They leak first, at the lodge. Emily sat a few chairs down from me, watching the table the way she always did quietly, without making it obvious. And when Evan moved around the room, playing the perfect host, smiling, checking on drinks, adjusting candles, I saw the version of him I had raised. Everyone else did too. That's the cruel part. When someone has been family for that long, their performance doesn't look like a performance. It looks like normal. It looks like love. And it's only later, when the truth finally shows itself, that you realize how easy it was to believe everything was fine. Not because you were stupid, but because you were proud, and pride makes you think you've earned safety. It makes you think the people you built will never become the people who break you. It didn't happen all at once. That's what people misunderstand about betrayal. They imagine a single moment, one dramatic choice, one sharp turn, one villainous decision. But most of the time, it leaks out in small, ordinary questions, the kind you can explain away if you're determined to keep the peace. And I was determined. In the months leading up to that dinner, Evan started asking about things he'd never cared about before. Not my health, not how I was feeling, not whether I was sleeping well, or whether the altitude up there near the lake bothered my breathing. He asked about files. He asked about forms. He asked about what happens if something ever happened. The first time, it sounded harmless, almost responsible. We were in my office after work, and he leaned against the doorway like he was just making conversation. "Uncle Marcus," he said, "who's listed on your life insurance right now?" I remember blinking at him, because the question didn't match the moment. "You're young," I told him. "You'll outlive me either way. Why does it matter?" He smiled, not nervous, not defensive, just smooth. "I'm just thinking ahead," he said. "You've worked too hard to have loose ends." Loose ends. That was the phrase. The kind of phrase people use when they want to sound mature. So I answered him. I gave him the clean version, the polite version. And because I'd raised him, because I'd watched him become a professional who spoke in calm sentences and wore expensive shoes, I told myself he was being thoughtful. A week later, he asked about my retirement accounts, the pension, the corporate benefits I'd accumulated over 30 years. He asked which plan rolled over automatically and which required signatures. He asked where the documents were stored. He even asked, casually, if there was an emergency, who would have authority to make decisions. Like, legally, most people would hear those questions and feel a coldness in their gut. I felt it too. But I didn't honor it, because disciplined people are trained to doubt their instincts until they have facts. And family makes you even more reckless than emotion does. You don't want to accuse someone you love over a feeling. So you don't accuse. You rationalize. You tell yourself it's normal. You tell yourself he's just anxious about the future. You tell yourself you're lucky to have someone who cares enough to plan. Then Laura came to me. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because she called while I was leaving a meeting. And her voice had that careful tightness people get when they're trying not to sound dramatic. "Marcus," she said, "can I ask you something without you getting upset?" That sentence is never a good sign. I told her to just say it. She hesitated. Then she said, "I saw Evan printing something at home. He closed the laptop fast. But I saw the heading. I stopped walking. Just stood there in the hallway with my phone pressed to my ear. "What heading?" I asked. Laura exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. It said, "Medical timeline." And there were dates. Like a template. A list of symptoms. A draft. It looked like something you'd submit to HR or insurance. My first instinct was to protect him. I hate admitting that. But it's true. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. That he was helping me prepare paperwork. That he was being overly organized. That maybe the company required something for retirement benefits. Then Laura said the part that made my stomach tighten. "There was an email draft, too," she whispered. "It wasn't sent, but it was addressed to someone in your company. HR, I think." And the subject line said, "Update on Marcus Hale's condition." Condition. I didn't have a condition. I had normal blood pressure for my age. Normal aches. A physical every year. Nothing that needed updates. I told Laura to forward me whatever she could without tipping him off. She didn't. Not because she didn't care, because she was scared. Scared of being wrong. Scared of accusing her husband. Scared of setting fire to her own life over a file name and a draft email. That's how good deception is. It doesn't just hide from strangers. It hides behind the decent parts of the people around it. And Evan knew that. He knew Laura would hesitate. He knew I would hesitate. He knew most people would rather doubt themselves than face a truth that would change everything. A few days later, I started noticing the rhythm beneath Evan's questions. He wasn't asking, "What happens when you retire?" He was asking, "What happens if you can't speak for yourself?" He wasn't asking, "How do I help you simplify things?" He was asking, "Who signs when you can't?" And then there were the calls he didn't talk about. The ones he'd step outside to take. He'd come back in with a smile that arrived half a second too late. He'd check his phone at dinner like he was waiting for something. And when I asked him, lightly, "Everything okay?" he'd say the same thing every time. "Yeah. Just business. Just business." People say that like it's a shield. Like the words themselves make the secrecy respectable. But I'd spent 3 decades advising executives who ruined their lives over just business. I knew what it looked like when pressure was squeezing someone from the outside. And I knew what it looked like when someone started building a story before the truth had even been questioned. Still, I didn't confront him. Not then. Not because I was afraid of him. Because I understood something most people learn too late. A person who's hiding something doesn't fear your anger. They fear your timeline. They fear the moment you start writing things down. They fear the day you stop reacting emotionally and start collecting details like evidence. So I did what I've done my entire career when something felt wrong, but the room still wanted to pretend it was right. I went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that surrenders. The kind of quiet that watches. The kind that listens for patterns. The kind that doesn't ask questions too early because questions give warnings. And warnings give people time to clean up their mess. I wasn't ready to accuse Evan of anything yet, but I was ready to stop handing him information he hadn't earned. And without saying a word, I started keeping track. Dates, comments, who he called, what he asked, how often. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that the truth doesn't disappear. It just gets harder to prove, the longer you give someone a head start. When you've spent most of your life in rooms where people lie for a living, you learn something that never leaves you. The biggest dangers don't announce themselves. They arrive wearing a smile. That night at the lodge, the air felt almost sacred. The fire in the stone hearth crackled low. The lake outside the glass was black and still, like it was holding its breath. Someone had dimmed the lights just enough to make the long wooden table glow with candlelight and polished cutlery. And for a few minutes, I let myself believe the story everyone else believed. That this was a clean ending, a celebration, a man stepping away from work with his name intact. I stood near the head of the table, listening to colleagues talk about old cases, old deals, old battles we'd survived. People laughed softly, the way they do when they're trying to be respectful. You could hear the ice shift in glasses. You could hear the quiet shuffle of plates. Then Evan moved, not dramatically, not like a villain, just a small shift of his chair. A lean, a hand that came forward like he was simply fixing something on the table. He was beside my glass. My whiskey sat there, amber and calm, a few cubes of ice floating near the top. The kind of drink you hold when you're supposed to look steady. I watched him with the part of my brain that never fully retires. His shoulders angled slightly toward me. His face stayed neutral. He kept his smile ready, as if he could lift it back up at any second. And then I saw it. A small packet plain, unmarked, hidden in the fold of his palm. He didn't pour it like someone rushing. He didn't shake. He didn't look around like someone afraid. He moved like someone who had rehearsed. The packet tipped. Something fine slid out. It didn't look like much. Not a pill. Not a tablet. Just a powder so light it barely made a sound. But I heard it anyway. A soft, dry whisper as it touched the ice. For a second, time did that strange thing it does in emergencies. Everything slowed down, but my mind sped up. I didn't feel rage first. I felt clarity, because in that single moment, all those small questions from the past months, insurance, authority, medical timelines, stopped being confusing. They became a straight line. My throat tightened, but my face didn't change. That's another thing you learn in the work. I did the first person to react is the first person to lose control of the room. So I didn't react. I looked at the table like it was a courtroom. Who had a clear view of my glass? Who was seated close enough to notice Evan's hand? Who was distracted? Who was watching? Emily Ross was across from me, mid-sentence, but her eyes lifted the moment Evan leaned in. Laura was 2 seats away, smiling at someone's story, unaware her husband's hand had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And then I saw Robert Kane. He was farther down the table, a quiet presence, older than most of the men there, with the kind of posture that doesn't bend to comfort. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes met mine for half a second. Not a question, a recognition, like he saw the same thing I saw. Evan straightened up as if nothing happened. He reached for his own glass. He laughed at something someone said. He was already back inside the story he wanted everyone to stay in. And that's when I understood what the real danger was. Not the powder. The narrative. If I stood up and accused him right there, I'd be the man who ruined his own farewell. I'd be the older executive who lost it. I'd be the one who made a scene with no proof. And Evan would sit there, looking shocked, looking wounded, looking like the dutiful nephew being attacked in public. That's the trap. When the truth is real but the evidence isn't visible, the liar gets to play victim. So I did the only thing I could do in those seconds. I made it ordinary. I let my hand reach for the stir stick in my drink like I was just fidgeting. And then I accidentally knocked it against the rim. The sound was sharp enough to cut through a sentence. The stir stick slipped and fell onto the floor. A tiny, ridiculous accident. The kind people chuckle at, because it breaks the tension without breaking the mood. Oh, for heaven's sake, I muttered, half smiling, like a man who's simply clumsy for 1 second at the wrong time. I leaned down to pick it up, and in that bend, those 2 seconds where every eye naturally moved away because no one wants to stare at an older man reaching under a table, I switched the glasses. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just a clean exchange. The whiskey in front of me became the whiskey Evan had meant for himself. And the whiskey Evan lifted a moment later was mine. I came back up with the stir stick in my fingers, shaking my head like it was nothing. I slid it onto a napkin. I didn't look at Evan. I didn't need to, because the shift had already happened inside me. I wasn't protecting him anymore. I wasn't carrying him anymore. Whatever this was, whatever he had decided to become, was no longer something I could fix with quiet conversations and second chances. And as I sat back down, listening to the lodge settle into its warm, polite noise again, one thought held steady in my mind. In a crisis, the most dangerous move isn't doing the wrong thing. It's doing the right thing without proof. So I stayed calm. I stayed seated. And I watched Evan lift his glass like the world still belonged to him. Evan stood up with his glass in his hand like he belonged at the head of that table, not because of his title, or his age, or anything he'd earned, but because the room was willing to believe him. He smiled first. The kind of smile that says, "I'm grateful." The kind that makes people soften without realizing it. Then he cleared his throat. "Tonight," he said, "is about a man who taught me what discipline looks like, what integrity looks like, what it means to show up, even when no one is watching." He didn't look at me at first. He looked at everyone else, at the colleagues who'd known me for decades, at the executives who liked neat stories with neat endings, at Laura, who was already teary-eyed because she thought she was watching her husband honor the family. And as Evan spoke, I watched what the room was doing. Heads nodding, hands tightening around glasses. That quiet, collective warmth people get when they feel lucky to be part of something meaningful. It would have been almost beautiful if I hadn't known what was in the whiskey. Evan lifted his glass a little higher. "To Marcus Hale," he said, 30 years of steady leadership. 30 years of carrying the weight so others could sleep at night." A few people murmured approval. Someone clinked their glass softly against the table like punctuation. And I felt something sharp move through my chest, not anger exactly. Something colder. Because the words were good. That's the part people don't understand about betrayal. The worst ones aren't messy. They're polished. They know the right tone, the right pace, the right lines that make everyone lean in. Evan turned toward me then. Finally. Like this was the emotional peak of his little speech. "Uncle," he said, voice thickening at the edges. "I wouldn't be who I am without you." A pause. Long enough for the room to absorb it. Long enough for Laura to smile like she'd won something. And in that pause, I asked myself a question I'd watched 100 juries wrestle with. What am I doing right now? Am I letting justice happen? Or am I letting something else happen and calling it justice? Because it feels satisfying. Because I'll tell you the truth, there is a thin line between consequences and cruelty. I knew that line. I'd spent my entire career standing on it, pulling people back from stepping over. And yet, the moment I switched those glasses, I felt the line move under my feet. Not because I wanted Evan to suffer, but because I stopped protecting him. That's what changed. If I had stopped him the second I saw that packet, the story would have ended right there. No proof, no witnesses, just family chaos. People would have told me later. "Marcus, you overreacted." Laura would have cried and begged for privacy. Someone would have convinced me to keep it quiet for the sake of his career. And Evan would have walked away with his clean face intact, maybe shaken for a week, then bolder the next time because nothing happened. But if I did nothing at all, and I drank it myself, then I was gambling with my own life just to preserve the mood of a dinner. So I sat there in the only place a man like me could sit, in the middle, in the space where you don't become the villain, but you also don't become the shield. Evan's eyes flicked down for a fraction of a second, to his glass, to the ice, to that amber surface that looked perfectly normal. Then back up, quickly, like he could erase his own thought by moving on. And that's when I noticed Robert Kane. He hadn't spoken much all night. He never needed to. But his attention sharpened in a way most people missed. Not dramatic, just precise. He watched Evan's breathing, watched the way Evan's hand tightened around the glass when someone clapped, watched the small swallow Evan did too early, like his mouth had gone dry. Robert didn't look at me for reassurance. He didn't ask a question. He simply observed, the way older men do when they've seen enough to know the difference between emotion and performance. Evan continued. He talked about family. He talked about legacy. He even used the word honor, like it was something you could borrow. And the room ate it up. That was the part that almost made me stand. Not the powder, not even the betrayal, the applause. Because people can forgive a lot when it's wrapped in the right speech. They'll clap for hypocrisy if it sounds like a tribute. And I felt a second question rise under the first one. How many times have I watched someone get praised for the version of themselves they were pretending to be? How many times have good people helped that lie survive? Just because they didn't want to ruin the moment, Evan raised his glass, higher. To the next chapter, he said. The room rose with him, chairs scraping softly, everyone moving as one. Laura stood too, smiling straight at Evan like she was proud of him. Emily's eyes stayed on me, though not wide, not panicked, just searching. And I understood why, because in that moment, I had the power to explode this dinner in front of 60 people. I could have stood up and said, "Put the glasses down, right now." I could have called a waiter, called the sheriff, held up the packet and made the lodge go silent. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, because I needed the truth to exist outside my mouth. I needed it to be witnessed, not just claimed. In my line of work, accusations are cheap. Evidence is sacred. And there's another truth people don't like when someone is prepared to betray you. They're also prepared to rewrite the story. If I challenged Evan too early, he'd simply become a victim in public. He'd cry. He'd deny. He'd make me look paranoid. And then the real crime, the decision he made when he thought no one was watching, would disappear under noise. So I made my choice. I lifted my glass with everyone else. I let the room think I was just an older man soaking in a tribute. I kept my face calm. But inside, I drew a hard line. I wasn't going to dirty my hands to teach him a lesson. I wasn't going to play revenge and call it righteousness. I was going to let his own action carry its own weight. Justice, in its purest form, doesn't need good people to get ugly. It just needs good people to stop covering for what's wrong. And as Evan brought his glass toward his lips, smiling at the room like he'd already won, I stayed still. Because sometimes, the strongest verdict in the world is silence at the right moment, followed by proof. Evan brought the glass to his lips like it was the most normal thing in the world, like this was just another clean moment in a clean story. He took a sip. Not a big one, just enough to be polite, enough to keep the room with him. Then he smiled again, and people began to lower their glasses, settling back into their seats, satisfied. The moment had passed, the tribute had landed, and for about 30 seconds, everything still looked perfect. That's what people don't realize about danger. It rarely announces itself with a scream. Most of the time, it arrives quietly while everyone is still clapping. Evan kept talking, finishing the last lines of his speech. He tried to add something warm, something grateful, but his words started to stretch, not emotionally, physically, like his mouth couldn't keep up with what his brain was trying to do. At first, it was subtle. A little pause in the wrong place. A syllable that came out heavier than it should have. I noticed it because I've spent my life watching people under pressure. You learn the difference between nerves and something else. Evan blinked twice. Slow, like he was trying to clear a fog. Then he reached for the water pitcher. His hand missed the handle by an inch. He laughed a little, like it was a joke, like clumsiness was charming. Some people chuckled with him, because that's what a room does when it wants to stay comfortable. But I didn't laugh, and neither did Emily. Emily was seated 2 chairs down from me, near the end of the table where she could see everything without being seen. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't the type to gasp. She just watched Evan's fingers, the way they trembled when he tried to set his glass down. Not shaking like a man who's had too much to drink. Shaking like a man whose body is being hijacked. Laura leaned toward him immediately. "Are you okay?" she whispered, loud enough that the people nearby heard. Evan gave her that same polished smile. The one that says, "Don't embarrass me." "I'm fine," he said. But the word fine came out slow. Thicker than it should have been. He swallowed again. Hard. Like his throat had forgotten how to do it on its own. Then he tried to stand, and his knee buckled. Just a fraction. Just enough that the chair scraped the floor and heads turned instinctively. That's when the room shifted. Not into panic, into attention. That's the moment people stop being guests and become witnesses. Laura stood up halfway, hands hovering, not sure if she should touch him. Her face was open, honest fear. She wasn't acting. She genuinely believed something was wrong with her husband. And in a way, she was right. Emily leaned slightly toward me, her voice barely moving. "This isn't alcohol," she said. I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. Evan tried to steady himself by placing his hand on the table. His palm slid over the wood like it couldn't find traction. A man at the far end said, "Maybe you need some air." Someone else suggested, "Sit down." "Son." Evan sat, but he sat too fast, like gravity had grabbed him early. Then he lifted his glass again, as if finishing it would prove he was in control. The problem was he couldn't control his hand anymore. The whiskey inside the glass trembled with him, the ice tapping softly against the rim. Tap. 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 A small sound, but in that lodge, it was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. Robert Kane didn't move quickly. He never did. He just set his own glass down, folded his hands, and looked at Evan the way a judge looks at a witness who started lying badly. "Evan," Robert said, calm as stone, "are you on any medication tonight?" Evan blinked at him, confused. "What medication?" Robert repeated. "Anything that interacts with alcohol. Anything that would cause this." Evan's mouth opened, then closed. Laura jumped in, desperate to make it normal. "He's been under stress," she said. "He barely slept this week. It's been a lot." Evan nodded like he wanted that explanation to be true, but his eyes didn't track right. They drifted, unfocused, then snapped back too late. Robert didn't argue with Laura. He simply kept his gaze on Evan. "Then answer the question," he said. Evan's jaw tightened, and there it was. Not fear of getting hurt. Fear of losing the story. Fear of being exposed. He tried to laugh again, but it came out wrong, half sound, half cough. "I'm fine," he repeated. But this time, his voice cracked. He reached for the edge of the table again, and his fingers curled like claws around the wood. That's when the first real ripple of panic moved through the guests. Not loud, just a hush. A silence people fall into when they realize they might be watching something they'll remember forever. Laura touched his arm. "Evan, please. Look at me." He tried. He couldn't hold her face in focus. And that more than anything shattered her. Because in 1 second, she stopped seeing her confident husband and started seeing a stranger who was slipping away right in front of her. Emily stood up quietly and moved closer. Not to touch Evan, but to see the table, to see the glasses, to see what could be preserved before people started grabbing things and cleaning up out of panic. Robert asked again, softer this time. "Evan, what did you take?" Evan shook his head too fast. No. He stopped. His tongue stumbled over the next word, and I could see it in his face. The moment his mind realized his body was going to betray him, he looked around the room like he was counting exits. But there was no exit from 60 pairs of eyes. Someone finally said the word. Everyone was thinking. "Call 911. A chair scraped back. A phone came out. And in that same heartbeat, Evan's control broke completely. He slammed his glass down, not hard, but clumsy, spilling a little onto the tablecloth. Then he stood up again, swaying, and his voice rose not strong, but desperate. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The lodge went dead quiet. Laura froze. Robert didn't blink. Emily didn't move. And I stayed seated because I knew if I stood, it would become emotion. And this moment could not be allowed to become emotion. It had to become record. Evan's chest heaved. He stared at me, eyes wide. And for the first time that night, he wasn't performing. He was pleading. I didn't mean he stammered. It was for your glass. A wave of confusion moved through the table. For his glass, someone echoed. Laura's voice came out small. "What are you talking about?" Evan shook his head again, like he could rewind time by refusing it. But the truth doesn't rewind. It only comes forward. "I put it in," he blurted, words tumbling now, ugly and uncontrollable. "The powder. I put it in his drink." Laura made a sound like the air got punched out of her. A few people stood up so fast their chairs toppled. Someone swore under their breath. And then Evan said the line that turned the whole room from shocked to horrified. But he switched it. He pointed unsteady, accusing, helpless toward the glass in front of him. He switched it when he dropped the stirrer. I didn't know until his knees buckled again. Emily stepped in, not to catch him, but to move the glasses away from hands reaching in panic. Robert barked. "Nobody touches the table. Not loud, just absolute." And people listened, because Robert sounded like law itself. I finally stood, not in rage, not in triumph, in procedure. "Call 911, I said, clear and even." "Now." Someone answered. "Already on it." "Good," I said. "And listen carefully. No one leaves until we know who saw what." I turned to Emily. "Get a clean bag," I told her. "Anything the powder touched stays sealed." She nodded and moved immediately, like she'd been waiting for permission to do what she already knew was necessary. Then I looked at Robert. "Will you stay with him?" I asked. Robert gave a single nod and stepped closer to Evan, watching his breathing like a man who understood two truths at once. A crime is a crime, and a body can still die. Laura dropped to her knees beside Evan, hands shaking, crying now, saying his name over and over like repetition could fix it. Evan tried to speak again, but the mask was already gone. And the most terrifying thing about that lodge wasn't the confession. It was the silence after it. Because when the truth breaks in public, the person who did wrong doesn't fear punishment first. They fear something more immediate. They fear the moment the story stops belonging to them. The paramedics arrived fast, but not fast enough to erase what everyone had just seen. They moved with that calm urgency people only understand when they've needed help before gloves snapped on. Questions asked twice. Bright lights cutting through the lodge's warm glow, like reality forcing its way in. Evan was on the floor by then, sitting upright with Robert beside him, breathing hard, eyes glassy, trying to keep his head steady like he could, will his body back into obedience. Laura knelt next to him, one hand on his shoulder, the other pressed over her mouth to hold back the sound she didn't want the room to hear, because the truth had already humiliated her once, and she wasn't ready for it to do it again. The medics asked what he'd taken. Evan mumbled something that didn't land. They asked again. He tried to point, to explain, to blame the moment. But moments don't matter to a medic, only causes do. Sir, one of them said, "We need to know what it was." Evan's eyes flicked toward me, not like a nephew looking at family, like a defendant looking at the one person in the room who could turn chaos into a case. I walked over, steady, hands visible, voice level. "I'll answer what I can," I said, "and I'll separate what I saw from what I assume, because that's the discipline most people forget when fear shows up. They start telling stories. I started making a record. They moved Evan into a smaller side room, what the lodge called a wellness suite, built for altitude headaches and sprained ankles from hiking trails. Tonight, it became something else. The room smelled like antiseptic and pine. A folded blanket sat on a chair like someone had planned for comfort, not confession. One medic checked his pulse. Another took his blood pressure. Robert stayed in the doorway. Quiet. His presence a boundary more than a person. And Emily. Emily was already doing what she does best. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking questions. She was collecting reality before it got trampled. She had a clear plastic bag in her hand, a clean napkin inside it. And she'd wrapped the glass Evan touched like it was evidence, which, in that moment, it was. She looked at me once, waiting. I nodded. "Keep everything sealed," I said, "and write the time on it." She pulled a pen from her pocket without searching. That's the kind of person you pray you have nearby when your life goes sideways. Outside the suite, the party had turned into a restless, whispering crowd. People were scared not only because someone might have been poisoned, but because they didn't know what role they'd just played in someone else's disaster. I heard someone say, "It's probably a misunderstanding." I heard someone else say, "No, that wasn't a misunderstanding, and I knew exactly where this would go if I didn't anchor it now." Because when a room gets nervous, it starts rewriting the story to protect itself. And the first person the room protects is rarely the victim. A sheriff's deputy arrived a few minutes later, then another. Not because this was a dramatic lodge full of crime, because someone made a call that used the right words. Possible poisoning, confession, witnesses. Those words make systems move. One of the deputies approached me. "Sir, are you Marcus Hale?" I gave a single nod. He glanced at the crowd, then back at me, lowering his voice. "We're going to need a statement." I didn't argue. I didn't embellish. I didn't perform. "I'll give you a timeline," I said, "minute by minute. Because when you're telling the truth, you don't need adjectives. You need sequence." I started with the dinner, the toast, the moment my stirrer hit the floor. The switch. I described the glass, the color of the whiskey. The sound the ice made. Who was closest? Who was looking? Who wasn't? I watched the deputy's pen move faster when I got to Evan's own words. It was for your glass. He switched it. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let the facts sit there, heavy and undeniable. The deputy asked, "Do you have any idea why he would do that?" And for a split second, I felt the old instinct rise. The human one. The one that wants to say, "I must have missed something. I must have failed him. I must have done something wrong." That's what betrayal does. It tries to make you prosecute yourself first. But I didn't let it. I have suspicions. I said, but I brought something that's not suspicion. The deputy looked up. "What do you mean?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. It was locked. Quiet. Ordinary. Like any other phone in any other man's hand. But I knew what was inside it. And Evan knew. Too, because his eyes sharpened for the first time since the powder hit the whiskey. Not with clarity. With panic. I met his gaze calmly and said, "Before tonight, you and I had a conversation." Laura's head lifted like she'd been slapped. "What conversation?" she whispered. Evan tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. I kept my voice gentle, not for him, but for the room. "For weeks," I said. Evan kept bringing up hypotheticals. What happens if there's an accident? What paperwork changes? How long it takes? Who gets notified? The deputy frowned. "And you recorded this?" I recorded one of them. I said, "Because when someone asks the same hypothetical enough times, it stops being hypothetical." I turned the screen toward the deputy, pressed play, and held it low enough that it wasn't a performance for the crowd. Just a fact placed on the table. Evan's voice filled the room clearer than he was capable of being right now. Not screaming, not threatening. Worse. Casual, measured, as if he were talking about weather. "If something happens to you," the recording said, it'd be a lot easier to get things settled." There was a pause, then Evan again. Quieter. Everything would finally make sense on paper. The suite went silent. Not because people didn't understand, because they understood too well. Laura stared at Evan like she'd never seen him before, and when her brain finally caught up with what her heart had been refusing to accept, she didn't explode. She collapsed. Her shoulders caved inward, her eyes went empty, and she made this small, broken sound, like someone realizing they've been living inside a story written by another person. A story where her love was just set dressing. "Laura," I said softly. But she didn't look at me. She didn't look at the deputy. She only looked at Evan, and you could see it on her face. It wasn't just that he'd done something unforgivable. It was that he'd been planning it while she was making dinner, while she was folding laundry, while she was defending him to friends. She hadn't been married to a man. She'd been married to a script. The deputy stopped writing for a moment. Then he nodded once, like a door had closed. "That changes things," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It takes it out of the realm of a bad moment." Emily stepped forward then, holding the sealed bag, the time written in clean block letters. "Here," she said to the deputy. "Glass. Napkin." Times noted. He took it carefully, suddenly treating the night less like a family emergency and more like what it was becoming. A case. I looked at Evan one last time, not with hatred. With that clear, hard understanding that discipline teaches you a good piece of evidence doesn't just prove what happened. It frees the innocent from the need to explain themselves. And in that moment, with his own voice still echoing in the room, I realized something that felt like a cold kind of peace. I hadn't just seen the betrayal. I had saved the truth from disappearing. They didn't arrest Evan on the spot. Not yet. That night, the deputies did what deputies always do when a room is full of money, titles, and people who know how to sound innocent. They separated us. They asked the same questions in different ways. They wrote down times. They listened more than they spoke. Evan sat on the edge of the lodge's little medical bed, pale under the harsh light, a blood pressure cuff still wrapped around his arm like a leash. Laura was across the room, quiet, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She wasn't crying anymore. She was doing something worse. She was rereading her entire life in her head. Robert stood near the window with his arms crossed, watching everything without moving. The lake outside was black and still. Inside, the air felt heavy, like smoke you couldn't see. A deputy asked Evan again. Why Evan swallowed. His throat worked like it hurt to tell the truth. And then he did what I'd seen desperate people do 100 times in boardrooms and deposition rooms. He didn't confess first. He negotiated. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he said. His voice was thin, not remorseful, just exhausted. I didn't want him dead. I felt Laura flinch at the word dead, like the room had slapped her. The deputy leaned forward. Then what did you want? Evan stared at the floor. His hands trembled as if they belonged to someone else. I just needed him. Out of the way, he said. Just for a little while. Laura's breath caught. I watched Evan's face as he tried to make that sound reasonable, like a business plan, like a mistake with a number you could fix. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach go cold. He truly believed the word temporary made it moral. The deputy said, "Explain." Evan's eyes lifted, just for a second, toward Robert, and then toward me, like he was searching for the right audience. The debt, he said quickly. That's what started it. He said it like the debt was a storm that hit his house, like it wasn't something he'd built brick by brick with choices. I'm in deep, he admitted. And it's not just credit cards. It's people. Robert's voice finally entered the room. Low, controlled. What people Evan hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the answer did. Investors, he said. Partners. I made promises. I missed payments. And then they stopped being polite about it. He glanced at Laura, and for the first time his face showed something close to fear. They told me if I didn't fix it, they'd ruin us. They'd ruin her. They'd ruin everything. Laura's eyes narrowed, not with sympathy, but with a dawning horror, because even then, he was saying us, as if she'd signed the deals with him, as if his lie had been a marriage vow. The deputy asked, "So your solution was to drug your uncle?" Evan shook his head fast, like the question offended him. "No, listen," he said. "I wasn't trying to kill him. I just needed him to lose control for a bit. Something that looks like a health episode. Confusion. A fall. Anything that triggers the process." The process, I repeated quietly, tasting how ugly that sounded in the air. Evan nodded, too eagerly, grateful I'd given him a word. "The paperwork," he said. "The benefits. The beneficiary updates. The pension. The insurance. If there's an incident, it speeds things up. People step in. Things get handled." Laura stood up so suddenly the chair scraped to the floor. "What paperwork?" she whispered. Evan looked away, and that was the moment her voice changed. Not loud, just stripped of hope. "What did you do in our house?" she asked. "What did you bring into our house?" Evan's jaw tightened. He tried to stay calm, like calm could make the confession smaller. "I drafted something," he said. "Drafted what Robert asked. Evan's eyes darted to the deputy's notebook, then back to Robert's face. A medical timeline. He admitted. Symptoms, dates, a narrative. So if anything happened, it wouldn't look random. Laura put a hand on the wall like she needed it to stay upright. You wrote a story about him getting sick, she said, voice cracking, like a script. Evan's silence answered her. The deputy asked, and the email to HR Evan blinked hard. He knew exactly what they were referring to. I didn't send it, he said quickly. I didn't send it. Laura let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You want credit for not pressing send, she said. After writing it, Evan's face twisted. Defensive now, like he was the one being treated unfairly. I was trying to protect us, he insisted. You don't understand what they were threatening. And right there is where people always want the story to end. They want a clean explanation. Debt, fear, pressure. Because if it's debt, then it's relatable. If it's pressure, then it's understandable. If it's understandable, then maybe it's forgivable. But I've lived long enough to know something most people don't want to admit. Debt doesn't create betrayal. It reveals it. Plenty of people are broke and still don't poison family. Plenty of people get threatened and still don't turn their home into a staging area for fraud. What broke Evan wasn't money. It was character. It was pride. It was the habit of avoiding responsibility until avoiding it becomes your personality. Evan kept talking, faster now, trying to outrun the shame. I just needed him to sign something, he said. Or for someone else to step in and sign. I just needed a window. A window. That's what he called it. A window where my body didn't belong to me. Robert took one step forward. His voice stayed calm, but it carried the weight of every courtroom I'd ever sat in. You don't get to call chemicals in someone's drink a window, he said. You don't get to call that a plan. Evan bristled. I didn't even know what it was exactly. Robert's eyes hardened. And you still used it, he said. That's not desperation. That's recklessness. The deputy looked at me then, like he wanted to know what I would do with all of this. Because people assume an older man, a mentor, a man who raised someone must either explode or collapse. I did neither. I stepped closer, just enough that Evan had to look at me. And I kept my voice even, the way you do when you're about to change the rules of a relationship forever. From this moment on, I said, this doesn't follow tears. Evan's mouth opened like he wanted to argue. I didn't let him. This follows documentation. I said, statements, timelines, evidence. I glanced at the deputy's notebook. Write it all down, I added, exactly as it was said, word for word. Because when someone finally shows you who they are, you don't win by screaming. You win by making sure the truth can't be rewritten later. In the days that followed, I didn't sleep the way a man sleeps after a scare. I slept the way a man sleeps after a verdict. Light. Broken. Alert to sounds that shouldn't matter. A floorboard. A phone vibrating. A car door closing outside. Because once you realize someone you raised is capable of harming you, your body doesn't forget it just because the room goes quiet. 3 days later, the lodge smelled normal again. Coffee, pine cleaner, old wood warmed by the heater. But my mind kept returning to one detail. Not the powder, not even the confession. The word Evan used. A window. That's what he called it. Like my health was a business opportunity and my life was a schedule he could rearrange. And that's when the truth finally landed in a way that hurt more than the shock. I had been carrying him for so long. He started to believe the carry was his right. I looked back, and the pattern was embarrassingly clear. When Evan missed his first tuition payment, I covered it. Quietly. No lecture. When he wrecked his first car, I handled the insurance call, the paperwork, the apology. When he lost his temper at a supervisor and nearly got fired, I made a phone call, smoothed the edges, convinced people he was still learning. And every time, I told myself the same thing. He's young. He's under pressure. He'll grow out of it. That's what good men tell themselves. We don't want to be harsh. We don't want to be the reason someone falls. So we catch them, over and over, until catching them becomes the relationship. And then one day, you realize something most people learn too late. When you rescue someone long enough, they stop seeing it as love. They start seeing it as policy. They start living like your strength is guaranteed, like your patience is a resource, like your sacrifice is part of their plan. The cruelest part is, you can feel proud while it's happening. Proud that you're the steady one. Proud that you didn't abandon a kid who needed you. Proud that you're the kind of man who shows up. And that pride makes you blind. Because pride whispers, I did the right thing. The right thing can't be answered with something this ugly. But it can. And sometimes it is. Laura came to my house a week later, not to argue, not to defend him. She walked in slowly, like she didn't know if she was allowed to exist in that space anymore. Her eyes looked older. Her hands held a folder, a real folder, paper clipped, labeled, organized like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart by keeping everything straight. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten holidays. The same table where Evan had once asked me for advice on buying his first suit. Laura didn't cry. She asked one question, and her voice broke on the last word. Can he be saved? That question was love. It was grief. It was denial fighting to stay alive. And I understood it more than I wanted to, because part of me still wanted to answer like the old Marcus, the protector, the fixer, the man who could make hard things less hard. But I couldn't lie to her, not anymore. So I kept my voice calm, and I gave her something better than comfort. I gave her the truth. Saving someone, I said, doesn't mean putting yourself on the table as collateral. She stared at me, like she didn't know what to do with that sentence. I continued, because she deserved a clean line to hold on to. You can care about him, I said. You can pray for him. You can want him to change. But you don't gamble your safety on someone else's potential. Laura swallowed hard, and if he says he's sorry, she asked. I nodded once. Sorrow is a feeling. I said, change is a pattern, and patterns are proven with time, boundaries, and consequences. She looked down at the folder in her hands. Inside were copies of things she'd found, drafts, statements, timelines, the debris of a life she didn't know she was living. I feel stupid, she whispered. I leaned forward slightly. No, I said. You feel human, because decent people don't expect evil at their dinner table. And decent people will write excuses for someone they love before they'll write a timeline. That's the part no one teaches you. The person hiding something doesn't fear your anger. They can manage anger. They can cry through anger, laugh through anger, twist anger into your overreacting. What they fear is your clarity. They fear you getting quiet. They fear you writing down dates. They fear you asking simple questions and refusing to accept dramatic answers. Laura nodded, slowly, like the idea was settling into her bones. And I realized I needed to say the thing people hate hearing, but need. Helping someone is not wrong. Being generous is not foolish. Loving your family is not weakness. But love without boundaries is not love. It's permission. And permission, given long enough, turns into entitlement. That's how family becomes dangerous. Not overnight. Not with one big betrayal, but with 1,000 small moments where you carry what they should have carried. You pay what they should have paid. You apologize for what they did. You clean what they broke. And then one day, when you finally say no, they look at you like you violated a contract, because in their mind, you did. That's why I didn't walk away from this story thinking, never help anyone. That's the easy, bitter lesson. I walked away with a harder one. Help. Yes, but with lines, with paperwork, with a stopping point you actually respect, because boundaries aren't punishment. Boundaries are protection. They protect your home. They protect your peace. And they protect the decent part of you from being turned into a tool. Life doesn't need you to win every fight. Life needs you to live right. And sometimes, living right looks a lot like saying, quietly and firmly, this ends here. 6 months after the lodge, I packed my life into 12 cardboard boxes, not because I was running, because I finally understood something I should have learned decades earlier. Staying in the same place doesn't prove you're strong. Sometimes, it only proves you're willing to bleed quietly. I chose a small town out west, one of those places where the morning feels honest. A lake that doesn't care who you used to be. A trailhead 2 blocks from the grocery store. One diner where the waitress remembers your order by the second week. I rented a simple house with a porch that creaked in the cold and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. The first night, I sat on the bare floor with a borrowed mug of coffee. No trophies on the wall, no framed titles, no polished speeches waiting for me, just silence. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like relief. My days became small on purpose. I woke up at 5:30, made the bed the way I was taught. 1 cup of black coffee, a walk by the water, even when the wind cut through my coat. I started keeping my life the way I kept my work, clean lines, clear routines, no dramatic detours. People think a new life happens when the world rewards you. A promotion, a windfall, a clean apology. That's not what this was. This was what happens when you stop playing a role that is quietly killing you. The news about Evan didn't arrive in one loud headline. It came in stages. A call from an investigator, a letter from the court, a brief update from a colleague who still spoke like he was trying not to disturb a funeral. Evan lost his license. His accounts were frozen. There was a sentence handed down that couldn't be argued away with charm or tears. No dramatic courtroom collapse. No movie-style confession that made everyone feel better. Just consequences. Quiet. Heavy. Final. And I'll tell you something that surprised even me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sober, because that outcome didn't give me back what I'd lost. It only confirmed what I already knew, that the boy I raised had turned into a man who was willing to gamble with my body to fix his life. For a while, I kept waiting for the part that people promise you, the apology that's so perfect it untangles everything. The moment he calls and says, "Uncle, I see it now." That moment never came. And even if it had, it wouldn't have changed the most important truth. Peace isn't built on whether the other person finally understands. Peace is built on whether you stop negotiating with what you know is unacceptable. That was the real turning point for me. Not the powder, not the investigation, not even the sentence. The turning point was internal. It was me stepping down from the job I never officially applied for, but somehow performed every day. The savior, the fixer, the man who could absorb someone else's chaos and call it love. Here's the part people don't say out loud. The savior role feels noble until you realize it's also convenient. It gives you a purpose. It gives you a reason to stay involved. And if you've been the strong one for long enough, being needed can start to feel like being valued. So you keep showing up. You keep smoothing things over. You keep carrying what isn't yours. And you don't notice the quiet damage until something breaks. But the savior role has a cost. It costs you your sleep. It costs you your relationships. It costs you your ability to trust your own instincts. And worst of all, it can cost you your dignity. Because when you're always rescuing, you eventually teach people that you don't require respect. You only require a crisis. That's why leaving that role isn't dramatic. It's not a speech. It's not revenge. It's a decision you make in the smallest moments. When the phone rings and you don't rush to answer. When the guilt shows up and you don't invite it in. When you realize you can love someone from a distance and still protect your life. In my new town, I started doing consulting work for people who needed it. Not corporate, not political, just practical. A local business owner trying to structure a partnership without getting burned. A young couple asking how to write a will because they had their first baby and fear finally felt real. A retiree who didn't want his kids fighting over a house the way families always do. I didn't fix anyone's life. I gave them structure. I gave them clarity. I gave them the thing I wish I'd given myself sooner. Boundaries that actually hold. Some evenings, I'd sit on the porch and watch the sun drop behind the line of trees. And I'd think of Evan, not with hatred, not with longing, with acceptance. I lost more than a nephew. I lost the illusion that kindness, by itself, can save someone who is committed to using you. That illusion is seductive. It sounds like love. It sounds like hope. But it isn't wisdom. And wisdom is what keeps you alive. I never chased a final conversation. I never begged him to explain. I never asked the world to understand my side. I simply moved forward. The way disciplined people have always moved forward. One honest morning at a time. One clean decision after another. Because a new life isn't a prize you receive. It's the result of the moment you stop volunteering to be the one who bleeds, and you finally choose to live, without bargaining away your peace. If there's one thing I learned from that night, it's this. The most dangerous moment isn't when you notice something is wrong. It's the moment you rush to confront it, before you can prove it. Because the truth doesn't just need to be real, it needs to be seen. It needs to stand on its own without your anger doing the talking for it. So if you're watching this, and you've been feeling that quiet alarm in your chest, here are 3 things that are enough to do before you ask a single question. First, write the timeline down. Not in your head, on paper, in your notes app. Somewhere it can't be edited by memory. Dates, times, who said what changed. What didn't make sense? People who are hiding something don't fear your emotions. They fear your timestamps. Second, stay calm on purpose. That sounds simple until you try it. Because when you're hurt, the instinct is to get loud, so the other person finally feels what you feel. But staying calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. Calm keeps you from saying the one sentence they've been waiting to twist. Calm keeps you from becoming the problem in the room. Third, don't confront without data. Not because you're afraid, because you're disciplined. If you go in too early, you don't expose the truth. You warn the liar. And once you warn them, they don't confess. They adjust. They delete. They rewrite. They recruit sympathy. They make you look unstable. So the rule is simple. Calm. Evidence. Boundaries. That's power. Not shouting. Not winning an argument at the dinner table. Power is being able to walk away and still have the facts follow you. And if you've lived your whole life trying to be fair, trying to be kind, trying to keep the peace, I know what this part feels like. It feels unnatural. It feels like you're becoming cold. You're not. You're becoming clear. Because boundaries aren't punishment. Boundaries are how you protect the decent part of you from being used. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had that moment when you realized someone only showed up when they needed something? When the love felt conditional? When the loyalty had a price tag? If you have, tell me in the comments. What was the moment you knew? And where are you watching from right now? What city? What country? I read those. And I'll tell you why I ask. Because the right question at the right time can save you. But the wrong question too early, it can save the person who's lying to you. So if you're in that place today, don't rush. Write the timeline. Hold your calm. And don't hand them a warning before you have the truth. If this story hit something in you, follow for the next one. Because sometimes the lesson isn't how to catch a liar. It's how to stop sacrificing yourself just to keep the room quiet.